first of all, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are from Poland Ecology, organizing these kind of events called Kapibara gatherings to meet with different groups and different aspects from academia, from organizing people. But also meeting with international groups like you. And now, before actually introducing you, I want you to introduce yourself. So I will start directly with the questions. I don't know how you share in between, but I will ask in three of you, Inea, Jack. Can you tell us about Climate Vanguard, about the name of the collective, who you are, what you do, how you organize yourselves, and about your aims in general? You can.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thanks so much for having us. Awesome to have these sort of discussion spaces. Really, really important to facilitate these things. So really happy to be here. My name is Jack. I use he, him pronouns. In terms of Climate Vanguard, I mean, our mission statement is that we're a youth-led organization empowering youth movements through radical political education. So I think that encapsulates quite a bit already there. In terms of our orientation, our foundational work is doing political education with movements and particularly young organizers. We do have a sort of strategic orientation towards youth movements, not specifically climate or ecological movements, but young people who are organized or politically active more broadly. So in various social justice movements, trade union movements, things like that. I guess the motivation behind the organization or some of the strategic direction that drives us is understanding political education as like a really important foundational aspect of movement building, of developing skilled organizers who can build the necessary people power we need to uproot various systems of oppression. And I guess based on some of our personal experience, that this is sometimes lacking from movement spaces, not sometimes like an overemphasis on action, on activism, and not enough focus on sort of theory, reflection, thinking about why we're doing what we're doing, strategy, and things like that. So that's sort of the impetus for Climate Vanguard to act as some sort of hub for young organizers to engage in that type of activity that we see as really like, I mean, elemental to praxis. So that's sort of high level, what we do and who we are. I guess a little bit more specifically to give you a picture of what that actually looks like. We organize our work on a sort of sliding scale from breadth to depth. Breadth trying to reach the most number of people possible, and then depth being our most in-depth form of political education. So on the breadth end of things, we do social media work, limitations of social media, but it's also an important space, and we have to recognize that this is where people are at, or a lot of people are at least. Then, like moving along that scale, we also write briefs, which are sort of short, accessible, written outputs on what we identify to be either key or foundational political education topics or kind of more conjunctural pieces to give our analysis of like what we feel is going on right now. Then even more towards the depth end, we run workshops, sometimes open to a wide range of organizers, and sometimes we develop those one-on-one with specific groups. And then at the very depth end of things, we will be launching a program, a kind of 4-month intensive program with a defined cohort of youth organizers based in Britain. We'll do for our first run of this type of political education, but that'll be a more intensive form of political education and the most in-depth form. So yeah, that's the sort of a little bit more nitty-gritty what our work actually looks like. And geographically, we work mostly in Britain, especially with the more depth end of things, but on the more breadth end of things, we do stuff with groups further afield or beyond Britain as well. So yeah, that's a little introduction. Hopefully colors in a little bit what we do as an organization.
Okay, thank you. Inea or Noah, do you have some things to add? Or like how you start your the Climate Vanguard in general? As far as I remember, it's been like 4 years or 3 years since you start the work.
Yeah, I can come in here. First
Yeah.
off, my name is Noah. I'm based in London and I'm a climate justice organizer. And in terms of our background, I started Climate Vanguard with Jack, and we spent a long time. This was around the early 2020s. I think 2021, we started taking the idea seriously. And we spent a long time, around a year, kind of figuring out what our vision for this organization was. And a lot of our inspiration for Climate Vanguard came about through our involvement in youth spaces, in the youth climate movement specifically, where we saw that young people had a lot of moral power and were able to put climate breakdown into the political limelight so that a lot of people were finally starting to talk about climate change and what it means for humanity, but they lacked the necessary social power to actually transform these oppressive systems which are causing ecological breakdown. And as Jack mentioned, for us, that was due to a shortage or lack of political education. So our inspiration for the organization was rooted in our concrete involvement in different social movement spaces. And then we took about a year to kind of figure out, okay, so what is this organization about? And that was a process of reaching out to a lot of different intellectuals and organizers to kind of run our original idea by them. And then also working out our structure and then working on our first major piece of work, which was on how we can nationalize and dismantle the fossil fuel industry in the UK. And that was prototyping a certain form of research where we provided a kind of policy analysis about how this could happen. And then we wanted to use that research to then support a specific social movement, which we did in the form of End Fossil Occupy, which was an offshoot of the Fridays for Future movement and was trying to escalate a bit in terms of its demands and also its tactics. So instead of saying system change, not climate change, it was specifically saying the fossil economy or fossil capitalism is to blame. And then also instead of school strikes, they were doing school occupations. And we use this research to help support some of the demands they were making, specifically the British chapter. So after a year of doing a lot of outreach, this initial research, we finally launched in the fall of 2022. So that was a bit of our process.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that you came mostly from the youth spaces, and you also emphasize in these aspects in your materials, in your speech, that the youth climate movement can be a kind of an agent in the transformation that you mentioned in these times of ecological breakdown. And from the interview you gave earlier, I had a kind of quote from this: 3 reasons for youth climate movement that you take the movement starting from the youth climate movement. But the question I want to ask, actually, how you see the youth climate movement like surge after it lost its momentum in the like after the Greta moment, let's say, in the 2018. Then there comes a pandemic. Then it got lost in its orientation in a way. But then it still keeps its strength in many countries in Europe, especially. But also right now in a kind of process of discussion, like you said, about tactics, about the strategy, about how they organize, or how to become a revolutionary agent in a way. How do you see the current situation in this climate youth movement in the general political arena?
I'm happy to start, and then I'd welcome Inea and Noah
Yeah.
to support me on the things I miss out on. But I think your analysis, I mean, is right. I would identify a similar trend, this sort of rise and fall, and then kind of searching now. And I think we could probably extend that analysis to the climate movement in the global north more broadly. It's probably not youth specific. But I think if we go back and map the sort of trajectory of that rise, at least, we're sort of in the late 2010s, largely spurred on by various bits of climate science that come out of the IPCC that then kind of kickstart or catapult new movements into existence. Fridays for Future, most prominently, but also that's the time when Extinction Rebellion comes on the scene, first in Britain, but then in a variety of other countries. And yeah, so there's like this explosion of activity effectively. And I think that then the downfall, there are probably some internal dynamics that could be identified, I think like poor strategy, what I'd identify often as like sort of liberal strategy, in some cases produce certain forms of exhaustion. People believed that by having leaders just listen to the science, then all would be okay. And some leaders did, start talking about climate science or even declare climate emergencies in some countries. And yet the actual like real trajectory of things did not change. And I think that produces a certain type of disillusionment that yeah, it forces people to do some soul searching or some deeper reflection, but also can be quite kind of dispiriting for a lot of people. And I think like not only the strategy or the politics, but also some of the organizational structures. Like if you don't have that organizational strength in place prior to this moment of explosion, I think it's difficult to like build it in the moment. And so that doesn't allow people to stay maintained in struggle for the long periods of time that are necessary. So I think those are like probably some internal dynamics that can explain some of like the rise and then fall. But as you mentioned, also there are external conditions like COVID, I think had a dampening effect on all types of movements, not climate specifically. And then subsequently, I mean, like just geopolitical shifts have taken up a huge amount of energy, whether that's the war in Ukraine or even more prominently, the ongoing genocide in Palestine. And rightfully so, like those things should take up our focus and attention. But I don't know if that's necessarily like a bad thing per se. Like I think that, I mean, what I've at least seen a little bit is like that people have maybe shifted from exclusively climate organizing, a lot of young people, then into like the Palestine movement and sort of developed more anti-imperialist politics, developed a more wide strategic or tactical toolbox, if you will. And also like others have learned how to synthesize struggles, like how to exist at the intersection of climate and social or geopolitical things. In Britain, at least, there's a group called Energy Embargo for Palestine, who are, or just that, a climate group. They're not huge, but they're a climate group that have become very prominent at the intersection specifically of Palestine and climate. So I think that's like a very positive evolution, certainly compared to like more liberal climate politics that maybe dominated at the height of this moment of explosion. So yeah, I think those are like some of my reflections on like causes of that rise and fall, and also like that it's not necessarily all negative. And I think maybe another thing is like we're gonna have to learn to deal with this. Like, yes, it's a challenge that there's other crises that activists have to then pay attention to and devote time and energy to, but like we are living in times of proliferating and compounding crises. And we just are going to have to learn to deal with that reality of how to synthesize struggles, how to be able to deal with multiple things at once. So I think that's not something to shy away from because we don't really have a choice, honestly, like that. We have to step up to that reality.
Before giving the word to Inea, I can add that campaign that you mentioned, energy embargo campaign, we also have right now among us a friend who is also involved in this campaign in Turkey. That campaign that we as Poland also follow and also try to practically involve as in many situations as possible. Inea, the same question maybe, but also how you see the challenges that about this youth climate movement since you begin, actually, in your perspective?
The challenges that are facing the youth climate movement, or
in your organizing efforts in general, but with the same questions, of course.
I mean, first, I'll just say, I think another thing that's really exciting about energy embargo for Palestine is that I think they're also building really powerful connections with groups around the world, and one of them I know is I don't know what it's called in Turkish, but I know it translates to, I think, like 1,000 Youth for Palestine, that they're doing work in collaboration with, and I think that's really also a really exciting development. Yeah, and as for challenges we faced in our organizing, I don't know if I have too much more to add than to what Jack just said. I think he covered the kind of the internal contradictions in these movements, and particularly in the politics of the movements and how that translates into political practice, and the kind of actions that movements take, as well as kind of these external forces that they are confronted with. I think one thing that I'll just add is that these external forces are, of course, can be let's say, like, they're definitely informative. They're educational moments. For instance, in this moment with Palestine, that I think a lot of, as Jack said, a lot of youth organizers are developing a stronger, or even like a stronger anti-imperialist analysis, or an anti-imperialist analysis to begin with. But I also think that these crises can be used to roll back the gains that a movementist approach kind of makes in some way. So I'm thinking specifically right now that every 5 years, the kind of European Council, or this body of the European Union, puts out their policy and kind of policy agenda, policy priorities for the next 5 years. And 5 years ago, one came out, and climate was a very prominent on this agenda, and this was in 2019, at the height of this youth climate moment, as we were speaking about. And 5 years later, this summer, the one for the next 5 years came out, and environment was mentioned only in the context of creating a conducive business environment for corporations. Climate was not on the agenda, and this kind of goes to show that Europe, this kind of European Union, which likes to think of itself as this champion of green politics, took the moment, particularly of Ukraine, to not just sideline climate, but also truly roll back a lot of ecological policies that they had before. Like, I come from agricultural science, and there was this then move to so I was following this quite closely. So there was this move after the invasion of Ukraine to do away with certain policies to increase biodiversity and just produce as much wheat as possible in the European Union, which of course has ecological effects, but it just shows that this kind of reformist movementist politics, when faced with these moments of crisis, they don't really have a way of negotiating with the powers that be. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the things that you mentioned reminds me about the materials you prepare. I will mention them for the viewers. You prepare some like training materials, short brochures about including imperialism, neocolonialism, the state question, eco-socialist party, eco-socialist program, and geoengineering and emergency brake. these are the titles of some of the brochures you prepare, and these are really important for us also. We Poland Ecology also take these discussions on an ideological level. They touch really very crucial points, these brochures. But it's also important to create a strong organization, create a strong unity in the organization. I want to ask first, how do you prepare these brochures in your collective? Like, how do you manage the discussion process, or when it comes to disagreements? Because you also mentioned in one of the interviews that you gave that your main ideological draw is coming from Lenin, which is really cool. But also there are many different, there can be many different interpretations of Lenin. So I don't know how you want to explain this.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I think that ideological and political unity is really important to an organization like ours, which focuses on political education. Because if we only have conjunctural unity, for example, a specific line on the movement for a free Palestine, but we don't have any deeper cohesion beyond that, then I think we'd find ourselves increasingly at odds on other crises and movements, which we know are going to emerge as we continue to kind of barrel headfirst into this very unstable period. So ideological and political unity has always been very important to the work we do. I think just to take one step back and to also dive in again into the history of Climate Vanguard, it was Jack and I who started it, and we were on this shared process of radicalization, or you could also say humanization, really seeking political answers to the ecological crisis, which we are aware of and increasingly worried about. And that was a really like a dialectical experience of reading, organizing, and discussing with each other about correct strategies that we need to pursue. And then that really poured the foundation of the ideological and political orientation of Climate Vanguard, the political education work. And as you mentioned in that interview, we said Lenin was a big inspiration for us, but I can speak a bit more to what our orientation actually is. So we are firmly rooted in the Marxist tradition, and in terms of a tendency, we align mostly with Marxism, Leninism. But I think it's also helpful just to talk about the principles that we have as an organization. We are anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and eco-socialist. And we've been inspired by numerous organizers, intellectuals, yes, Marx and Lenin, but also others like Mao, Fanon, Cabral, Rodney, Fred Hampton, Marta Honecker, and in a more contemporary sense, Jason Hickel, Max Eil, and Vijay Prashad have been big inspirations and continue to shape some of the work we do. When we were fortunate enough to access some more resource and we were able to bring in another member of the core team, we made ideological and political unity really important in terms of who we brought on. And we were really, really psyched when we found Enea's application because there was immediately such high degrees of alignment where we felt like we were able to work together effectively as a collective. And that alignment is not dogmatic rigidity, but again, more so to have that basis where we're able to pursue political education work and our organizational objective of seeking to raise the consciousness of organized youth. I guess to actually get to your question in terms of like our process of putting together some of these pamphlets and other materials, because we have this shared ideological and political basis, we quickly have alignment on the actual objective of, say, a written piece of work or a workshop and what a rough outline will look like. We then usually do some form of division of labor where we take on respective sections of this piece of work and we go away and do our own research and then we write it or if it's a workshop, kind of put together an outline, and then we put it all together. And at that point, some disagreement can emerge. But I think it's not so much disagreement as having robust discussion about things that we kind of disagree with and going through cycles of feedback and editing, which is a very normal process. But we've never had a situation where we've had such intense disagreement where we have to resort to what is part of our governance structure ultimately is where we have extensive debate and then ultimately hold some kind of a vote on a certain line, whether that's in terms of our political communications or an aspect of a piece of work that we're putting out. That has not happened yet, but we do have we do have that in place in case it's necessary.
I will also say, just to add to that briefly, is that I guess part of our internal process in terms of like cultivating that ideological unity is we do put time aside and run internal political education sessions. So with people who might be joining us who are new, who haven't been part of the organization before or whatnot, we have like regularly built into our schedule of work internal political education sessions so we can sort of like cultivate and have like how that be part of our like regular political practice is like having these discussions in a formal, structured fashion, in an informed fashion. So it's not only doing like political education in an outward fashion, but there's like an inward process that I think helps cultivate that unity as well.
And thank you. Actually, we wanted to ask this question both about this to learn more about this ideological unity, but also to learn more about the long-term goals of the Climate Vanguard, maybe because the one of the discussions is about, for example, Eco-Socialist Party, and in your brochure you mentioned some examples from Communist Party of Austria, some examples from Venezuela, France, Mélenchon's organization, and Workers' Party from Belgium. These are really the aspects of these examples you can take can work in your context. But I want to add to these discussions that do you have a long-term goal evolving to be a kind of a party like these ones from like these examples? And also in relation with that, you have a eco-socialist program sketch that it can be a basis for this kind of a party. And how do you relate these program with the previous examples of this eco-socialist manifestos, for example, from the early 2000s or 2010s? Do you have any comparisons and like this long-term goal about the Eco-Socialist Party?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this, and then maybe the other comrades can come in. But I think maybe it might make more sense to touch on the program first. So I can provide a rough sketch of what this program is for those who haven't read it. And it's premised on three structural transformations, which are mostly based on what eco-socialist construction would look like in the global north or in the imperial core. And the first focuses on democratizing the means of production so that we can liberate the productive forces from the profit imperative and actually produce things that meet human needs and social aspirations. And for us, that also includes taking control of the bourgeois state and turning it into some kind of participatory organ for eco-socialist construction. And that includes, of course, democratic planning. The second aspect would be decommodifying what we call the means of survival. So things like food, energy, water, housing, education, healthcare, basically everything that we need for individual self-development and collective flourishing. And we see this as an area where the law of value is really being targeted and dismantled. Then the third aspect is decolonization, which means we need to end all neo-colonial, colonial, and settler colonial domination and ensure that all nations have restored control over their productive forces and can use them for their own socio-ecological development. And for us, that strikes at the heart of the capitalist world system, which is this drain from the periphery to the imperial core. And also part of this aspect of ecosocialism is addressing internal forms of colonization, which takes form in cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and ableism, and the responsible institutions, most prominently the police and prison system, as well as other forms of state violence. So those are the three aspects of our program. So it's democratization, decommodification, and decolonization. We were inspired by a lot of different things that we had read. I don't know if it's specifically, I'm familiar with some of the debates that were happening in the earlier 2000s, but I guess some of the works that we did take a lot of inspiration from include Less is More by Jason Hickel, A People's Green New Deal by Max Eil, The Red Deal by Nick Estes and the Red Nation, and then also some more original work, State and Revolution by Lenin, which at the time of writing it, we were very inspired by. So that also factored into it. Yeah, and I think this program at least crystallizes one kind of tendency in the ecological left, which holds three positions. The first is that it's not only about being anti-capitalist, but also about being staunchly anti-imperialist. The second is that this kind of area of the ecological left takes the state question seriously and views it as necessary for eco-socialist transition. And the third is that it's sympathetic to certain arguments that are made by degrowth, as opposed to the kind of contradictory side of things, which would be embodied by the eco-modernist position. So that's the work that we've done in the program. I'm happy to share it in the chat for those who haven't read it and are keen. Maybe to transition into some of our work on the party. So, I mean, this is a topic that we've been very interested in for a while. And what you've been hearing from all of our different kind of personal testimonies, but also the organizational work that we do, is that, you know, most of our political experience has been in movement spaces, and movements obviously have been very important protagonists in the ecological struggle. But a lot of young people have been noting that there are these reoccurring deficiencies in some of our movement spaces. And we kind of identify three, some of which have already been mentioned. But politically, oftentimes the politics are quite nebulous and unclear, which leads to too broad of a political and ideological tent, if you will. The second is in terms of structure, oftentimes there's a disavowal of clear structure, which can lead to power imbalances as well as certain democratic deficiencies. And then thirdly, a lot of movements just don't have a revolutionary strategy for eco-socialist hegemony. They're focused on certain issue areas, which is very important, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to stitch those together into a common project. So we recently came out with a piece of work on the Eco-Socialist Party, where we want to directly speak to some of the youth organizers who are having similar questions about movements, but have not yet really thought that through. And we wanted to make the case for a revival of the party, or as Marta Honecker calls, the political instrument, which is language that we really like. And in the brief, we focus on these three core functions of the party. The first is unity. So it's able to unite these counter-hegemonic struggles, from direct action groups going up against big oil to tenants unions who are combating exploitative landlords, to the mass movements putting pressure on the politicians who continue to enable a genocide in Palestine. The party is able to unite them into a counter-hegemonic project for eco-socialism, which is adapted specifically to the national context in which these struggles are happening. The second core function that we identify is direction. So the party has a clear strategy, which includes an analysis of the root causes, a positive vision of a world transformed, and also is able to formulate these momentary objectives on an ever-shifting terrain. So it knows when to advance when the conditions are favorable, but it also knows when to retreat when the conditions are not that good anymore, and we kind of need to reconsolidate and build up our strength again. And then the third function, which Jody Dean writes a lot about, is endurance. So this idea that the party is able to capture the mass energy of demonstrations, nurture it, and then actually redeploy it again at those decisive moments. And then the other aspect is that it's able to pass down information from past struggles so we do not make the same mistakes again and don't need to learn all of these new tactics over again. So those were the kind of functions that we outline in the brief. And in terms of our own conception of the party and our organizational role in building it, I think it's not so much as Climate Vanguard becomes an eco-socialist party, but more so that we use our political education work to help raise consciousness amongst certain layers of organized youth, not only in the climate space, but also in the social justice space, in the trade union movement, about what a party is, why is it necessary, and also equipping them with the ideological, political, theoretical, and strategic capacities to be effective cadre in this party formation. So we see ourselves as an organization more so helping to contribute to the emergence of a party.
In your interview, you mentioned that in 2024 plans, you narrow the focus on mainly to the England, UK, to actually to do this political education more face to face. Let's say, I don't know which one of you go to more England or based in England, but how is this process going on? Like, how do you what kind of reaction you get so far in this year? What I want to ask actually, in this kind of processes, there is always a tension between the masses looking to social democracy, like the Labour Party in England, for example, and like detaching them from the labor basis, basically. It's the kind of the main problem in many cases, especially in Europe, probably. Did you have the same problem, or like when you do this kind of work face to face more, what do you notice about this? Maybe Inea, was it there?
I think I would give it more to Jack, as he's
Uh-huh.
I'm
Yeah.
the one that's not based in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm happy to start talking about that at least. That's a really good question, and I think relates to the last one and some of the stuff that Noah is discussing. I think like the state of things right now in Britain is actually like the issue is not so much that there's a lot of people putting their hope in the Labour Party. I think like there's actually a pretty interesting sort of political opportunity right now in Britain in the sense that both major parties, the Conservatives who just lost the election in the summer and the Labour Party who just won the election, are kind of like historically unpopular. And part of that was manifest through, I mean, a very, very low voter turnout. So I think the voter turnout in Britain was 60%, which was the lowest in about 100 years. Or it's the second lowest in history, like barely. So it's almost the lowest voter turnout in history in Britain, which indicates some sort of political sentiment, which is a very positive one, and indicates some form of political opportunity. And I think that we're not the only people on the left having discussions about the party or like the organizational form that is necessary to take advantage of this moment and drive it forward. And so I think the general reception has been like positive, and we've sort of arrived into this conversation along with many others. I think that one thing I think one challenge that we've experienced in starting to discuss like the party is a variety of misconceptions about like what a party is. People either understand it to be like another bourgeois party, or a party that primarily focuses on electoralism, like a difficulty to actually conceptualize what this looks like. And so I think that's some of the work of trying to like understand other examples, as we highlighted in our brief, of other forms of political organization that are doing work that's certainly distinct from strict electoralism and are also not movements, but have very close connections with campaigns and movements. So like, I think trying to clarify what the possibilities in terms of a party or what a party could look like is some of the work. And I think another portion of the work, at least in the British context, is that there are already a large number of very, very small political organizations that call themselves the Revolutionary Party. And so like this is a terrain that's just like real in the British context and has to be negotiated. And there are open questions about like, what do you do with that reality? First of all, like analysis about like how that came to pass. How did historical circumstances produce this outcome and how do we not repeat that? And also like, what do you do with the existence of, multiple dozen small left parties that are like largely insignificant. So like that's like the kind of political terrain that's being navigated. And again, I think going back to the last question in terms of like, what is our role or how do we see like the evolution of Climate Vanguard within that strategic orientation? I think the task of anyone thinking about this type of question, like first has to ask, sort of like, what are your capacities? Like, what do you have? Like, it's nice to say like, oh, we want the party, but you have to be like materialist and grounded in like, what can you actually contribute? What are the resources at your disposal? How many people are you? What level of unity do you have? And I think like our contribution at this stage really feels like crowding in a larger number of ideologically aligned, talented young organizers who can sort of coherently devote themselves and have discussions about what the process of forming such an organization would look like in Britain. But that's sort of an overview of some of the political terrain that we're navigating and the types of responses maybe we've gotten from having some of these discussions.
A follow-up to this maybe then, are there any like a pre-party formation or group that you find yourself closer in that terrain that you mentioned?
Not at the moment. I think we're involved in debates more so in an individual capacity. I put in the chat that there was this really interesting 4 or 5 part discussion series in a popular social movement center in London, which was focused, I think it was actually called Party Time. So it was trying to bring together all these conversations around a shared notion about we need a new form of political organization and the various debates that were housed within, whether that means, okay, labor at this point we know is dead. It's purged all of its leftist elements. It's full on zombie neoliberal party. But then there are some comrades who say, okay, we need to gravitate more towards the Green Party, which has kind of tapped into some of the momentum and energy that was there around Corbyn. Others are saying, oh, we just need to fuse together the Trotskyist sects. And then still others are saying we need a new form of political organization. Anyways, all of those debates were kind of had at this center in London, I'm sure all across the country as well, but they brought in comrades from the Belgian Workers' Party and Mélenchon's party, and it was really interesting. But in terms of our work organizationally, our focus right now is more so working with a diverse set of young people from different social movements and just having a space of political education, raising our collective consciousness around the forms of political organization that we need to be effective in this political conjuncture.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we are like there are particular organizations that we are connected with. I don't know if we'd so much like identify that as like that this is going to be the party. But for instance, there's an organization called RS21 or Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century. And they do quite a bit of political education work, they write a lot, which is interesting. And they're trying to build a membership organization. I can send their link. And so I think like there's also just kind of this problem that there's just like a lot of little groups that maybe don't have like the aesthetics that would necessarily attract a mass of the working population. Also, just one thing that I wanted to say to your original question about these kind of summits or programs that were developed in the early 2000s, or like 2010s. Two that immediately came to mind for me was less programs, but more like gatherings. So one being the World Social Forum, which of course is still ongoing, but started in the kind of the heat of the ultra globalization movement. So I think it started in 2001, and is kind of this gathering of civil society organizations, and I think they meet also in January, kind of to counter like the World Economic Forum that takes place in Davos, of course. But I've heard that it's kind of been, I mean, I think probably in part because of yeah, I mean, because of a kind of a lack of clear political direction, and because I think some of the more radical forces in it, like Hugo Chavez and Morales and some of these more radical leaders have, in the meantime, been or no longer in power, and I think it's kind of been I've heard that it's it's kind of a co-opted space now, but I guess that's up for I don't know that personally, so that's just what I've heard. And then to another one would be the People's Agreement of Cochabamba and like the Gathering of Cochabamba, which was in 2010, and how our program relates to that. I think that would be, I mean, it relates very directly, and that I think that was a great inspiration. The document that came out of these gatherings was a great inspiration for thinkers like Max Eyl, and also for the Red Nation, that kind of brought together peoples of the majority world to speak about what collective liberation would look like. That centers collective, like human and non-human flourishing. And I think in that document there, for instance, is this very like the centering of the rights of nature, but also the rights of people for sovereign development, and a part of that would be like ecological and climate debt. And I think that was then something that has very much informed our thinking about what like an anti-imperialist eco-socialist movement would be. So I think I mean, all of these movements and these gatherings and developments of thought are building on each other, and yeah, so they become like or in the words of Thomas Sankara, we are the heirs to the world's revolutions. So I think that's one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's fitting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, I have 2 or 3 more questions. Then we can have some comments or questions from the viewers here. Shifting from more ideological, theoretical questions to maybe to more current political questions. But before that, is a bit mention about the one of the like more theoretical discussion, but also have political implications, that about degrowth. I want to ask how you see degrowth as a like a political idea or in your programmatical views. Although we as pollen don't use the framework this global north, global south, but it has different meanings in different countries, or different in the imperialist countries or in the colony countries. So how do you see, maybe especially Inea, you work with maybe in Barcelona, about its connection with the like imperialism, anti-imperialism, and colonialism, and in the future actually also about the socialist planning, maybe the connections of the growth. Did you have a evaluation or discussion around it?
Yeah, I think this is a tough question that I think I don't really think that there's an answer, and I can kind of explain that. But like degrowth is not a homogeneous kind of school of thought. Like, I mean, of course, like Marxism isn't a homogeneous school of thought, but I think there are some basic tenets that give more unity within like Marxist circles than is the case in degrowth. And accordingly, because there isn't like a homogeneous way of understanding degrowth, or through a degrowth framework understanding the world and what is to be done, I think they're like how degrowth relates to these different aspects of colonialism and imperialism and socialist planning. There isn't like a uniform relationship there. I suppose something that's also like worth highlighting is that like the things that connect degrowth, there's like these central ideas of like critiquing GDP and infinite economic growth, and kind of growth ideology that legitimizes that. And I get this, I think like Kai Heron writes about this really, really well, and I think he's been a really important voice in bringing this to light, that through those central ideas that I just listed off, there isn't really like a coherent politics that emerges from them. Like you can critique GDP and be a liberal, and you can critique like capitalist growth and be a Marxist, but that actually like that's not a coherent or like a unified politics. And of course, like a lot of degrowth literature, certainly not all of it, but a lot of it doesn't then actually tie the phenomenon of growth to capital accumulation. It's like growth itself is the problem, rather than the motion of capital that and the accumulation of capital that give rise to growth. And again, I think like one thing that Kai says is that growth is epiphenomenal. It's like it's not the like material base, and I think that's that for me, when I heard that, I was like, oh, that makes sense. But yeah, because like, degrowth has this very varied politics, it's this umbrella term, as I said, that like attracts all flavors of the ecological left, from, as I said, like liberals or like social democratic liberals that kind of just want to like have a big green state, and then like more anarchists who would like want nothing to do with the state, and then of course this like insurgent wing of anti-imperialist Marxists, who like Jason Hickel I think is a really important member of that insurgent wing. And I think that that like his influence has been really important in this sphere, like in the degrowth space. Yeah, and so I think based on those varying politics, they would have different approaches to those different things. I think a lot of them, I mean, I think quite key to degrowth thought is like the history of of European colonialism, and like US imperialism. These, of course, like I think there's kind of a disavowal of them, but then, as I said, like what that actually means, who is imperialist, how we resist that is very different between them. And then, yeah, with socialist planning, I think that there's really interesting work being done in the field of degrowth. So I think, like, as I'm very personally close to the degrowth community. I live with two of the people who are doing PhDs under like under the supervision of Jason Hickel right now. One of whom is doing his PhD about the relationship between disasters and degrowth, and like what would a degrowth response to disasters be, which is of course very important in this age of social and ecological crisis. Some of his fieldwork is going to be actually in Valencia, where there were the floods a couple of weeks ago, which was an unbelievably catastrophic, like very classed, or the class dynamics within this struggle were very apparent, because it was a working class community that was flooded, and it was working class people who died. I'm getting off topic, but I think it's really important. And then the other one is doing his PhD about kind of post-growth deals for Europe, and kind of thinking about what would European policies be. So that's then like pretty much planning. So these people are very much like, all right, like degrowth requires planning, but I think that's not a consensus within the, or I know that's not a consensus within the field. Yeah, and so I think that for me, the aspects of degrowth that are interesting, like eco-socialism, it's this kind of seeking a qualitatively different and a qualitatively better way of living. But for me, a lot of the things that are exciting about degrowth and the stuff that's being worked on here, including more like explicitly anti-imperialist projects, like what does delinking look like? How do we quantify unequal exchange, and how does that inform our analysis of anti-imperialist movements and how we delink, or like how nations of the South delink, and the projects I mentioned of my roommates. I think these are really important, but for me, like, I don't really think, for me personally, that like degrowth is necessarily necessary to think about those things. And I also don't think it's necessarily like the thought of degrowth is that novel. I think that like you can hear the speeches of Amilcar Cabral or Fidel Castro, and like what they're saying is like very similar to what degrowthers have kind of like reinvented. This like a critique of growth, and then tying that, of course, to unequal levels of development around the world. That being all said, and then I'll wrap up, I do think that degrowth still plays, like, it does still serve a purpose, even though I don't personally necessarily vibe with it so much. Like, I have nothing against degrowth, it's just not how I identify my politics. But we we live in extremely anti-communist societies, and eco-socialism is to many people not an attractive term, that's going to turn certain people off from and not actually, so they won't actually listen to what you're saying. And even if the ideas themselves would be very exciting to people, there are certain people that for whom degrowth is just a more approachable term. And if you can use a concept to for political educational purposes, and one that allows people to start developing a systemic critique of capitalism, which I think Jason's book Less is More does really beautifully. It kind of says, like, what is the history of capitalism? Why is it shit? And then kind of motivates people, inspires people to think about a systemic alternative, then I think that that's a beautiful thing, and we should use it where it's useful. And so yeah, I think that's why political education work is important, particularly like Marxist political education work that then intervenes at this time when people are starting to question capitalism, but and have this kind of understanding that we need a different world, but don't necessarily have like a Marxist analysis of how we get there and what this other world actually entails. So yeah, those are my thoughts on degrowth. If Noah and Jack have anything to add, they're welcome to do so.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I also think almost the same with you about the degrowth in general and how you explain it. And I also find it very interesting and appealing discussions around degrowth, about the aspects you mentioned about disasters, for example. Yeah, but like going to the more current situations, like you are also very vocal, and you mentioned also the campaign about the energy embargo for Palestine, vocal about Israeli genocide in Palestine, and like calling for action and solidarity. And this is kind of very distinct among the climate movement, it seems. I mean, despite all the efforts since this last year, we couldn't stop the genocide anyway. But how do you evaluate the whole process, like in terms of resistance, imperialist politics, and anti-imperialist politics in Europe or in the climate movement? And of course, the like ecological question and the link between ecological question and the genocide. I remember there was a recent interview of Andreas Malm. He was talking about some of the activists in the climate movement shift to the Palestine resistance, and it it gave also the like a disorientation to the climate movement, which is like a not a bad thing, of course, but maybe he's just pointing out. But how do you evaluate the whole, both the general in the resistance in the world, the process, and these discussions? Any of you, I don't know.
I've been talking a lot. The thing is we split up your questions, which is why some of us are talking more
Yeah.
on certain questions.
Yeah.
But I apologize that now it's just been me talking at you all.
Go.
But yeah, I guess so. To the Malm interview, I didn't watch that. Though I think I saw clips on it, but I remember someone commenting on it online. I thought this was what they said. They were kind of critiquing what he said. And I forget exactly how they were critiquing it, but my kind of the thought I was having is in response to this, that I would just, I think, like to bring here as well, is that I think the climate movement was already disoriented before the movement in solidarity with Palestine began. I think that's the kind of what we were saying at the beginning of this conversation as well. That I think due to like both these internal contradictions of like insufficient strategy and or poor strategy and poor politics, or liberal politics, but you know, same. So that was already disorienting, especially after not winning and people being very motivated for a long time and then not winning, and I think that's disorienting or de-escalating. And then of course like the Ukraine war and these things. So I think like it was, I don't think so much that like Palestine disoriented the climate movement so much as it provided a space in which, or like an issue around which, people who politicize through climate could find energy in organizing again. I mean, this is certainly the case with a lot of young people that I've spoken to or worked with that, yeah, like I said, cut their teeth in climate activism, then we're just lost motivation to keep struggling, and then have said like they found it's the first time that they've felt good in activism for a long time. And I think maybe where it is disorienting, though I don't know if I'd use that term. I'd say more it's bringing up contradiction or like frictions, is that like, I mean, we see it most clearly in like the German climate movement, as they have been like the rest of kind of Germanophone society, absolutely horrific on the issue of Palestine. I mean, of course, there are dissenting voices within, but it's like as a whole, there's this very strong Zionist hegemony, which is also taking place in the climate movements. And so I think this is something that this is a point that Palestine has brought up in the climate movements, is people having to reckon with imperialism. But I think in the end, as we've been saying, it's a positive development, because it pushes people, it brings up these contradictions, it brings up frictions, it brings up discomfort, and that's ultimately how we grow. I think, yeah, especially if there are people who are willing to have hard conversations and engage with each other as people, which isn't necessarily always the case. But I think, again, to bring it back to energy embargo for Palestine, because I think they're doing incredible work. This is a part of their strategy, very deliberately. The campaign itself in London was born of, or before they established the campaign itself, or the group, they beforehand had written an open letter last fall, shortly after the genocide began, that climate movements could sign on to. And and a reason for doing this was to show some kind of united front against genocide, but also to provoke movements within their groups to have, like, internally, to have discussions about whether to sign on. And we know for a fact that there were groups that for whom this was really difficult. But I think that is like so important. And so they're in general pushing this line of anti-imperialism and kind of problematizing militarism more broadly in British and climate movements more broadly. And I think this is really important. But yeah, to the rest of your question, on like kind of the resistance and our kind of the state of our movements right now, or like what, yeah, we're I don't know, 14 months in or 14 and a half, and it's yeah, it's utterly like I can't, there's no words for how heartbreaking the situation is. Yeah, but I think, yeah, I mean, I guess countering or like stopping the genocide ultimately entails countering US imperialism. And because like the Zionist entity is this very important ally and like proxy of the US and upholds US imperialist interests in the region and the world more broadly. And so in order to counter US imperialism, we have to be we have to wield immense social power against empire, and this requires organization, which, as we've been discussing, is lacking in around the world. The left is historically weak. This is not our own fault. We've been systematically targeted anti-communist campaigns throughout the last century have been debilitating, and we've not had kind of this endurance, as Noah was speaking about. We don't have like the long organizational memory that like empire does. Like when they try something on, it doesn't work. They have continuation within their organizations, that they remember this and learn. And so I think this has, because of the decimation of the communist left, or just like the socialist left, liberalism is of course extremely is hegemonic. I mean, and it in our movements, and so it's, yeah, I guess politics based on asking those in power to do the right thing. So these marches that we saw weekly, which is not a bad thing. I'm happy that people are getting out into the streets, but it's still yeah, I mean, I think we can hold that truth and say like it's good that people are motivated, but also recognize that it's not truly reckoning with the fact that the very basis of the ruling class's power is bound up in the maintenance of the imperialist status quo, of which the Zionist entity is so important. In many ways, like they historically have been important to smothering popular struggles around the world, like in the Arab region, but also like as we're seeing in Palestine or Lebanon or Yemen, but also beyond. I mean, they've supported and trained counter-revolutionary forces around the world, so the US could kind of keep their hands clean. But they, for instance, like trained Contras in Nicaragua or the junta in Argentina, and supported Portugal's struggle against anti-colonial forces. And yeah, in the Arab region, they are like incredibly important for like de-developing this program, like programmatic of de-development and destroying infrastructure for the popular classes to reproduce themselves, but also for them to struggle and revolt. And I think like we have seen this in Syria in the past week. I mean, I think it's insane how quickly the Zionist entity occupied or like just pulled into the Golan Heights and is already planning settlements, is planning like military infrastructure there, and has just decimated the Syrian army's infrastructure to revolt. And I think this is very strategic to consolidate their power in the region. Yeah, and of course, so all of this, like this, their existence, and like US imperialism more broadly, is like what allows for the continuation of of value extraction, of this polarized accumulation in certain parts of the world, and denial of sovereignty to the most of the rest of the world. And yeah, of course, this links to ecology and the climate question, because those systemic drivers of ecological breakdown are also the systemic forces behind imperialism. And I think that's so important. And again, why groups like Energy Embargo for Palestine and stuff that we're trying to do as well is like connecting those struggles and really showing these are different faces of the same problem. And they have to be struggled against in tandem. And so yeah, I think why we haven't been able to prevent the genocide. There's actually this journalist in the States who named Chris Hedges, who in an interview once said, "Politics is a game of fear, and we've lost the ability to make them afraid." And I think that really stuck with me, because I think a lot of the ways that we do politics doesn't actually make the ruling class afraid. And so I think that we need to build social power, and I think there are organizations that are doing this important work, like Palestinian Youth Movement, for instance. But I've been talking for a while, so I'll wrap up.
Are there anything you want to add, Jack and Noah? I mean, it's been a great to talk with you. I hope we do more in the long run after this one. I hope we meet more. I have some questions more, but they are similar questions, and like the things about what's happening in the last 2-3 weeks in Syria and so on, Ine mentioned already. So we are at the heart of this problem that we are living in Turkey, and the Kurdish question, the situation in Kurdistan is directly in connection with what's happening in Syria. So there are three main enemies of the peoples of the region, like the ones imperialist powers and these reactionary regional states, these colonialist states, Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq, colonizing the Kurdistan and different countries in the region. And there are these proxies, kind of proxies, but also have their own agenda and goals, like Daesh and like this HTŞ, these kind of people. But there are also forces of peoples fighting against these three enemies, let's say, main enemies. Actually, I want to give the word now to the viewers. If there are any other questions or comments, then we can have a more like a chilling chat, let's say. I don't know how we do it actually with the interpretation right now. Are there any questions? You can, I think, open your mics and ask in the original audio channel, and I can translate it into English if you want to ask in Turkish. Let me check the chat if there are any questions. There are some comments, but I won't read them. It's a bit long. Güney. Go, Güney.
Thanks, Ine, Noah, and Jack. This was very nice of you and very informative as well. I have two questions. One is, I understand that Climate Vanguard is not a membership organization or a political party at this point, but do you have any relationships, be it personal or organizational, with political organizations in the UK in the broader UK, like the Welsh Underground Network or the others? And B, whether or not you have been part of any international coordination, any international attempts to come up with some sort of alternative to the conference of the parties, or whatever the hell is going on the bourgeois level of politics at the international stage. Pollen Ecology has been somewhat imperfectly participant in an effort to develop such an international coordination with the participation of many organizations from many countries all around the world. So that's my second question. And actually a third question to be added to that. Do you also have any relationships with diaspora organizations in the UK? I'm specifically asking the questions in the context of the UK, because as far as I understand, it is a UK-based initiative at this point. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is a huge Kurdish and Palestine diaspora, as far as I know.
Yeah, and things are very complicated at the moment in that specific context. And also when listening to you, I don't want to, deepen this at the moment, but when speaking of anti-imperialism, what we have been going through in the past 2-3 months is also represents a fault line also in that sense, because it seems to me at least that there are anti-imperialisms, and just like there are Marxism, Leninisms, there are also anti-imperialisms, and yeah, it's just it turned into a rabbit hole at this point. It's very difficult to outline, sketch a consistent answer within a few minutes. So that's why I don't want to engage in that. I don't want to push you in that direction. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start, and then Jack, maybe you want to come in. In terms of your first question on concrete political connections, I mean, we've worked with various different youth climate campaigns. So as I said, we worked with End Fossil, we've worked with Green New Deal Rising, and we have loose connections, as Anea said, for example, with RS21, which is the Revolutionary Socialists for the 21st century. And also we've worked with Energy Embargo for Palestine. So we don't have any more concrete connections as an organization, albeit as individuals, we're active in different movement spaces. Yeah, and in terms of international efforts at trying to create something different than COP, we haven't been super engaged on this front. We are aware of different initiatives that are around. So a couple years ago, we were at the Eco-Socialist Encounters in Lisbon, for example, which was more of an ideological network and less of a mass kind of people's gathering. And we were also aware of the Earth Social Conference last year, which was in Colombia, kind of an attempt to create a counter COP, but we didn't put a lot of organizational capacity in that. Yeah, Jack, maybe you want to take the question on. I can also I'll just round it off. Yeah. In terms of diaspora organizations, again, like no concrete connections, although we have worked a bit with, as I said, Energy Embargo for Palestine, but also the Palestinian Youth Movement, specifically the British branch. But that form of engagement hasn't been very intensive.
Though I'll just add that we're hoping to get more involved in their current campaign that's targeting the logistics company Maersk, but we're still in the process of kind of figuring out how we'll do that.
Yeah, we were there the last year in Colombia with the friends with Máximo from Portugal. Actually, I'm sure that they will in contact with you. They are very active in that,
Yeah.
reaching out.
What was your experience like at the conference?
It was a nice experience. I mean, it was a good effort to bring all these organizations together from different parts of the world. But of course, like the ideological diversity is hard to organize in that kind of space. That created a bit of problem, I think. But the whole process of organizing that conference make everyone get to know each other and understand the contexts of these different countries and different approaches. I mean, in the end, right now, the coordination, the climate coordination, there was this decision to create a kind of international coordination there. Didn't work out well. It kind of got stuck all after that, after a few months. But still, there are at least like trials, attempts that what works, what didn't work. So in the end, we are still like actively following these kind of links, circles, and relations, and to make them a bit stronger. Hopefully with you also.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, it's so important to have like actual spaces for coordination, like institutional structure to have these types of moments of coming together, which are not, I mean, in particular in the ecological landscape, like not adjacent, not like surrounding COP or not attached to COP, because there's so much that muddies things so much and complicates things so much, of course.
Yeah. And let's see if we have, in 2 years, there might be a COP in Turkey, that there is this Turkish candidacy for the next one after Brazil. So there might be a kind of a big responsibility for us ahead of us waiting. Are there any questions or comments, friends, here? Or then we are slowly coming to an end. I will give the stage for the last words to you then, and then we can finish.
Zach, you go ahead. Yeah.
Well,
Let's go.
not
Get
many,
us going.
yeah, not many final words other than just like really appreciate the time to come and discuss together, and like hopefully in future if we stay in touch, have more like discussion-based stuff, because we'd love to hear from you all as well, rather than us speaking so much. But it was a real joy to come and answer some of these questions things that we love like discussing and think about and focus on a lot. So really appreciate the space and time for everyone who came.